my slides. Okay, hopefully my cursor is big enough now that everybody will be able to see it, and I won't be moving it around too much. So what I'm going to be going over today is a suite of programs and different platforms that are used to host PsychoPy3 experiments online. And so if you've ever created an experiment in PsychoPy3 and put it online, you'll probably be familiar with these different things, such as Pavlovian and Gitlab. But if you haven't, I'm going to be explaining everything kind of from the ground up. So this is kind of aimed at beginners, but we're going to get into it pretty quickly, and hopefully we'll be able to cover some new functionalities in GitLab that some people aren't familiar with. So the first thing is, well, why be talking about this at all? And the real reason is to try and kind of maximize the effectiveness of remote work. So we've been doing, well, obviously everybody's been doing this recently in their labs. And what I noticed is that we were wasting a lot of time in our meetings just doing housekeeping, essentially. So I kind of came up with these different aspects of a remote work environment that would make it ideal. So the first one is to maximize meeting time for strategic decisions, which means kind of keeping everybody up to date with one another's progress without having to be in direct contact. This also helps to keep things asynchronous so that two people can work on the same project, but don't necessarily have to be working on it at the same time. I think we're finding as we're working from home that we all have free time very sporadically throughout the day. If you have children, especially if you have pets that are demanding like me, or if you have other commitments within your family, then you want to make sure that you're able to work effectively whenever you have the time to. And so that means being able to work together in teams, even though you don't have overlapping schedules. And the other one is to just reduce the amount of unnecessary email that you have to read through to make sure that you're staying up to date with what your colleagues are doing. And so I've already been using GitLab quite a lot to, well, I'd already been using GitLab prior to everyone working from home, but it seemed like a useful platform because it basically facilitates all of these things that we need to create an ideal remote work environment. So the goal of today's Open Office Hour is to understand the relationship between PsychoPy3, GitLab, and Pavlovian, and to learn what those things are if you aren't already aware. And then we're going to learn how to make changes to a PsychoPy3 group project. So we can learn how to use Git and GitLab in order to work on PsychoPy3 projects together while being apart. All right. So the first thing, what is PsychoPy3? Most of you probably already know. It's an experiment development software. And the key feature of it is that it allows you to design projects that can be run on web browsers. And also, critically, it's free, which is great. All open source software. What is GitLab? So GitLab is a project development platform, and it kind of comes part and parcel with PsychoPy. So as soon as you upload anything from PsychoPy onto the internet, it's going to be stored on GitLab. It also contains a lot of useful features for supporting this kind of asynchronous collaborative remote work in that it kind of tracks the activity of all of the members who are contributing to a project and allows for version control. So you can always revert back to previous versions of the project that you're working on. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later, though I won't really get into that in detail in this Open Office Hour. Again, critically, it is free. It has a free version. There's also, I think, a premium version that you can sign up for. All right, and the last thing is Pavlovian.org. So this is a website, and it acts as the public platform for everything that you make in PsychoPy3. And it kind of creates a unique URL that hosts your experiment. So it's kind of like it's your experiment's home on the internet. And this we have to pay for, and you pay for it every time someone runs your experiment successfully. So you don't have to, there's no subscription fees or anything like that. It's just pay as you use it. So how are these three things related? You can think of them in terms of like a product metaphor. So thinking about a product, we basically build our products in a factory, and that would be PsychoPy3. Once you've built your product, you need to store it somewhere while you wait to distribute it, and that would be GitLab. It kind of acts as the online warehouse, or you could, in the kind of lingo of Git, it would be called a repository. So that's where all of your experiments will be stored. All the files that that are required to run the experiment are all going to be on the GitLab warehouse, so to speak. And then following this metaphor, Pavlovia acts as the storefront or shelf space that you purchase to make your experiments or products available to the public. So we can also visualize this in a different way. So by looking at what's on our local computer and what's online. So our local computer is where we're going to actually build our experiments using PsychoPy3. And there will be a folder on our computer where all of these files are stored. But then we also need to have our warehouse and storefront will all be on the web. And the way that these two locations, the online and the local, communicate with each other is via a secure connection, which is created by Git. And that's what I'm going to be going over a little bit today and showing you how to use Git manually to actually communicate back and forth between your local and the online repositories. So essentially what Git does is make sure that whatever on your local computer mirrors whatever is on your repository online. So this is going to be the kind of flow I'll go through today. So I'm going to be working with two different accounts, and you can imagine that each of the accounts is a different person with a different computer. So I've created a Words in the World account, which I'll be using, and you can imagine that's a separate person, and I'll also be using my own individual account as Jordan. And again, so I'll just, this will be how I can kind of show how two people could potentially be working on a project together. So I'll start out by going into a project that I've already created in the Words in the World account, and I'll share that project with myself. Then I'm going to start making changes to that project. And we'll go through these different stages of cloning the project, adding changes, and then eventually accepting those changes as using the other account. And if I have time, I'll show you two different ways that you can do this. Okay. So let's get started. Let's go to Pavlovia. Just close all of these. All right. So the first thing, I'm going to go and explore all the projects on Pavlovia. So this is the platform. You can see all of the other projects and experiments basically that are created by other people. These are all made public. So that's a choice that you have when you create a project on Pavlovia to make it public or not. I'm going to search for an experiment called, I've just called it OpenOffice Hour 2. And I'm going to search for it, and it's not going to come up because I've actually made it private so that it's not accessible to the public. So I'm going to log into the Words in the World account that I've created on Pavlovia and find that project, and I'm going to share it with myself. All right, so I've kind of navigated to, let me just go over that one more time. So I've got my Words in the World account on Pavlovia. I can go to my experiments. This is a list of all the experiments that I have on Pavlovia, and I'm going to access the OpenOffice Hour 2 experiment. So we'll just take a quick look at this. So by piloting it, so it's going to ask for my name and my age, and I'll click OK. And we can see that this is just a simple lexical decision task with a couple of stimuli. So I'll press L when I see a non-word and A when I see a real word. And if we go all the way through the experiment, which only has 8 stimuli, when I'm in piloting mode, it's going to save the data output file directly into my downloads folder where I can see it here. So that's all working just fine. So I'll close this. Now, if I want to get into the GitLab repository for this experiment, I'm going to click the View Code button, and this brings me into GitLab. So now I can see this project and all of the files that are associated with it. Now it's from this screen that I can start to add other members to this project. So in this case, let's say I want Jordan to add additional stimuli to this experiment. I'm going to go to the Settings tab and select Members. Now here I have the option to invite any other Pavlovia user that I want. So I'll just search for myself. There we go. And I'm going to give myself maintainer permission. If you want to learn more about this, just click on the link here and it will show you all the different kind of things that each permission level is allowed to do. I could also set an expiration date if I wanted to do that. But I'm going to add Jordan to the project. And so now this project has been shared. Let me just show you that again. So if we go down to the bottom, it's going to show me all of the members that are associated with the project. So we've got the Words in the World grant account and also my account. So now I'll be able to access this repository from my own account. So if I log out, let's sign out here. There we go. Okay. Sign out. Okay, so I'm going to sign in with my other account, and I should be able to access that project through my Experiments tab or by exploring. So if I go here, I can see that I have this new project that's that's owned by Words in the World, and if I click on this, I'm also able to pilot it, and I can view the code. And now I'm inside this repository. So I can see that the person who owns this repository right now is Words in the World. Now I have two options. So the first one that I'm going to show you is I'm going to fork this project by clicking this button over here. So when I fork the project, what it does is it creates an identical repository that's associated with my account. Okay, so it says the project is successfully forked. And now I can see that the owner is actually me. So if I go back to my experiment dashboard, I should also see a new project that's appeared that's owned by me rather than the Words in the World account. So it should be here. There we go. So we have the same project here. All right, so now that it's associated with my account, I need to basically load this onto my computer so I can start making changes to it, especially if I wanted to start making changes to the actual experiment file using PsychoPy. So the way to do that is by cloning this repository. That takes everything that's online and it's going to copy it onto a location that I specify on my local computer. So you can see a clone button over here, but unfortunately this is not the end of the story. So this will give me the location of the repository that I want to clone. And so I can copy the URL or the location online. So I'll go ahead and do that. But now what I have to do is open my command prompt. Now I'm sorry, I don't know exactly how to do this. If you're a Mac user, I'm pretty sure it's called a terminal. If you're a Windows user, there's a quick way to do it just by pressing the Windows button and R, and you'll get this run window. And if you type in CMD here, and then OK, it will open up command prompt. Now, I know this can be very unusual and unfamiliar for a lot of people, but if you just kind of get over your initial shock of like having to interact with your computer in this way, everything is actually pretty straightforward. So command prompt will open me automatically into this folder on my computer inside users, and that's my username on my computer. Now I want to navigate to my desktop because that's where I want to actually copy this repository to. That's where I keep all of my experiments. So I'm going to type CD, which means change directory, and just go into the desktop. And now I'm in my desktop. So that's kind of how you change locations. If you wanted to change, like if you aren't sure how to find the different directories, you can just go to the directory in the search window. If you click up here, it will give you the direct URL, or not the URL, but the path, sorry, to the location on your computer. So if you wanted to, for whatever reason, include it in your documents, you just click this and copy this, and it will give you that destination. Okay, so once I'm in the folder that I want to be in, I'm just going to use a git clone command. So git clone is a command that requires two inputs from me. The first one is going to be that location online of the repository that I want to copy. So I'm just going to paste that in. So that's the URL that I copied from here. And now I need to give it a folder to basically store everything in. And I'm going to create a new folder. So I'm just going to type this, OpenOfficeHour_Jordan. And this is going to clone that repository from the internet onto my local computer. So I can close this now. And if I go to my desktop, I can see that this new folder has been created. And if I open this up, I can see all of those files that I saw on my repository online. So at this point, I can start making changes. And the only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open the stimulus file, and I'm going to add some new stimuli. So let's add purple. That's a real word. And bulb, which is not a word. Okay, and that's all I'm going to do. I'm just going to add that one additional stimuli. I'll save this. And remember that I need the stimulus file is actually two different locations. So it's going to be here in the main folder and also inside the resources folder. So I'm going to just delete that and copy the new one in. I'll just double check that this is in fact the right version. There we go. Okay, so now I've made changes to two files within this folder. If we go back to the main folder, we can see actually this Git folder, and that's what's creating this connection between this local folder and the repository online. If you can't see this, it's probably because your view options are not set to display hidden items. So if I don't have that displayed, I can't see that Git folder inside here. Okay, so also what this Git folder is going to do is also track. It tracks all the changes, but it also tracks the history of all those changes too, which will allow me to do version control later on. Okay, so I've made the changes I want. Now I need to upload all of them onto the repository online. So one way of doing that is by going into PsychoPy itself and just clicking the sync button. So that's one option. The other option I'm going to show you is to do it manually using Git. So I'm going to open command prompt again. Sorry, one of the other ways to do that is by going into your start menu, and you can go down to Windows System, and command prompt should be under there. I think sometimes it's under accessories, but in my case it's under system. All right. Now I want to navigate to this this new folder. So I'll just click at the top here and copy that. Go back to command prompt, and I'll type cd and then copy in that the path to the folder where my experiment is. Okay, so the first command that I'm going to use is git status. Git status is going to look at my local folder, and it's going to look at my repository online and tell me what's different. So I click this, it's going to say that two of these files, both of the stim files, have been modified, and that's great. It's also going to tell me that no changes have been added to a commit. So you can think of a commit as either like a snapshot of all of the changes you've made to a project. You can also think of it as kind of a package that you then send to a repository to make changes. So at the moment, our current commit is empty. There's nothing that we're sending to the repository online. So the way that we add new changes to each kind of package of commits, or package of changes in a commit, sorry, is to use this git add command. If I do git add space full stop, it will upload all of those changes into the current commit. Technically, like the other way to say it is that they're all staged or added to the staging area. So if I type in git status again, now I can see that these changes have been added to this staging area, so to speak. Now I can package all of them together in a commit, which I can then label and then upload onto my repository online. So I'll do that using this git commit command. By typing -m, I'm able to add a label to this kind of package of changes. I'm just going to say added new stimuli. So that's the kind of the label for this package of changes that I'm going to be making. If I press enter, then I can see that I'm changing 2 files, and in total, I've made 4 insertions. So I've basically added 2 stimuli to each of those files. If I type git status now, let me just move my cursor, it will now show me that there's nothing new to commit. Essentially, all the changes that I've made have now been kind of added to a package that's going to be sent to the repository online. And the way that I send that is just by typing git push. That's going to take all of the changes that I've made and push them to the repository online. There we go. So I can see that all of those changes have been made. So if I go back to this repository and refresh, I should see those changes have been made. So I can see this added new stimuli is now under this last commit. So it's showing that this file was changed under this commit. If I click on this file, I should see that I have those 2 new stimuli that I created before. So far, I've only made a change to the repository that's owned by me. This hasn't actually affected the project that's owned under the Words in the World account. So if I want to actually take the changes that I just made and affect the original project, I'm going to have to do a merge request. So if at the moment, if I were to log out and look at the repository on the Words in the World account, the 2 new stimuli that I made are not going to be included there. So if I click over here on merge request, I'm going to create a new merge request. So I'm going to select the branch. We don't have to worry about branches right now because typically there's only going to be 1. And so I'm going to take this source branch, which is owned by me, and the target branch is owned by Words in the World. And so I want to compare these 2 branches. So what this does is it's going to look at the differences between these 2 and tell me what the changes are. And the title will be, yeah, sure, added new stimuli works just fine. I can also write a description. So I could say added purple and purple, I think it was. And that's all that I did. There's also other options that you can have a look at here. I won't go over these right now. Just make sure that these are set up correctly. And I'm going to submit the merge request. Okay, so now everything's done on my end. Now I'm going to sign out from my account because I've finished all the work that I wanted to do on this project today. I'll sign in again, and I'm going to sign back in using the Words in the World account. Okay, so we can imagine that some time has passed. The Words in the World person is now coming on to do some work, and they see that there's a new merge request. There's actually another fork as well, so they can see that, well, they should be able to see that I've forked the project. So I think this sometimes takes a little bit of time to update. So if we look at the merge request, here's the merge request that was created by me 50 seconds ago. So if we click on this, we can now see all of the different changes that were made by the other member of the project. So I can look at the commits. There's the commit that I added, that add new stimuli. And if I look at the changes, I can see inside each of these folders that these lines were added to the stimulus folder. So I can kind of preview all of the new stimuli that were proposed by my kind of team member, and I can decide whether or not I want them to influence this project under my account. And if I'm satisfied with all these changes, which I am, I can click this merge button, and this will take all those changes that were made by the other member and commit them to my repository. So now, if I go back, so again, this is the repository that's owned by Words in the World. So I've just accepted all those changes. And if I look inside here, I can see those two new stimuli. And so that's, well, that's kind of it. If I look at the activity, I'll also be able to kind of track all of these changes. So you can see that I was also doing this earlier. But here would be the merge request that I sent, and then it was accepted here. And using the kind of version control functionality in GitLab, let's say we decided that adding those two additional stimuli was a horrible mistake, and we wanted to kind of reverse all of that. You could do that using the revert commands, but I won't go into that right now. Okay, so, well, we're kind of at half an hour, so I think I'll stop there. Another way that I'll just quickly mention is that rather than forking a project over to your own repository, it's also possible to clone the project directly from here and effect changes that way. But by forking the project and then cloning it that way, it allows you to keep kind of track of all the changes that team members are doing using these merge requests. But yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for now. And maybe if we have time at the end, I can go over some of these other things, but I think I should allow time for questions.
Great, thank you, Jordan. If anyone has a question for Jordan, feel free to either unmute yourself and ask your question that way, or if you want, you can also just enter it in the chat. Make sure your chat is addressed to everybody, and then we'll be able to see it and address that way as well.
Jordan, it's Gary. I can start us off. Can I ask about, so I can see, I'll make sure my microphone is good. Okay, I can see that there be, say, in my own world, immediate applications. So for example, I could perhaps want to make stimuli in German or in French, and it wouldn't necessarily trust my spelling or my something, and then a native speaker on the team would come in and check and make changes as appropriate. So I think that's kind of great for multilingual experiments. But if I can extend that, would it be easy in such an experiment to say swap all the stimuli out for Japanese stimuli? So just basically make a Japanese version of that experiment, and using this platform to ensure that otherwise they're absolutely identical?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of there's a lot of potential applications of this. Not necessarily what I showed today, but maybe parts of it. So what I've already done that I kind of suggest taking a look at, if I'll just share my screen again so I can kind of talk through this. So the whole idea behind creating this Words in the World account was a place to host what I've just been calling experiment templates. So within on this account, all of these are made public. So what these are is different experiment templates for different kind of typical psycholinguistic experiments. So I've got a maze task, lexical decision task with progressive demasking, audio stim with transcription or typing, visual stim with typing, and a self-paced reading task. So the reason I created these was to kind of make a toolbox for people to use who aren't necessarily that comfortable with PsychoPy or new to the program. And so what you can do with these is that you could download, like if you click on the repository, they're all made public. So they're publicly searchable on the Pavlovia platform, or you can just navigate directly to this URL. And once you're in here, you could do the same thing I just did by forking the experiment and then cloning it onto your computer. From then, you can add, well, you can make any changes you want. You could add you add a stimulus list. You can make changes to the experiment itself. But what it does is it gives you a kind of jumping off point, so you don't have to be creating these experiments from scratch. Now, if we take the same logic, you could also use the same functions to replicate another experiment, just like you mentioned. So you could take an experiment that someone's created in the past that's been made public. You can then fork that experiment over to your account and then just replace the stimuli and run the experiment again. Similarly, you could just run the same experiment again with the same stimuli, replicating and see if you can replicate the results with a different participant population. So I think that's the real strength. It's a huge, it's a very useful tool for open science. And so I imagine that any project that I kind of finish moving forward, as soon as I'm done, I'll remove all the data, obviously, and then make the repository public. And that will allow anybody to kind of replicate my methodology precisely, which I think is a real strength. And then similarly, well, the way that I've been using this currently is essentially other labs who are kind of just starting out using PsychoPy3 to create online, here, I don't need to share my screen right now. Other labs who are creating experiments on PsychoPy3 but are running into like technical issues. What you can do is just make the repository available to me or whoever you want to come in to try and help on the technical side of things. You can share your repository with them, and then they can have a look at everything that's going on in the project and make all the necessary changes to get things working. And then, just like I showed today, just submit that merge request, and then you can just take all of the changes that that they made kind of separately, upload them onto your project, and then stop sharing with that person, because you often don't want to have other people accessing your repository for ethics reasons. But that's really powerful for that. So you can really bring in other people onto your project. Similarly, like you just mentioned, if you need some kind of expertise in terms of the stimuli that you're creating for the experiment, using platforms like this really cuts down on the number of emails you need to be sending back and forth. And it gives you this very transparent way of looking at all the changes that were made, but also tracking those over time. So you can track the contributions of different people or different members onto a given project. So although it, like anything, it takes a while to get used to and to start using, the reason I wanted to highlight it is because I felt more than a lot of the other software that I've been using lately that the payoff is potentially really high for getting comfortable with this kind of platform.
Fantastic, Jordan. Thank you. There's another question for you in the chat, so if you just open up that, take a look.
Thank you for the presentation. What kinds of files can GitHub host? I assume it can be used to share all files for a research project. But just to confirm, also can merge requests be approved by one or more persons? Yeah. So great question. You can host anything. So this is actually something I'm kind of aiming for moving forward, is to include everything I do with a given project within a GitLab repository. So this includes from the stimuli to the experiment file, also the R script or SPSS if you're using that, and then also to the actual write-up. So you can continue to track changes just like you would in a tracked document in Word. So you can actually have everything that's associated with a given project all kind of localized in one area so that you can continuously make changes to either the write-up or the data analysis. And eventually, this would also, if you're also including all of your R scripts, for example, and all of your data files, that opens up the potential for completely transparent research in the future if you're able to make that repository public. I know for a lot of, I know a lot of, for ethical purposes, a lot of, you can't really share data files widely at the moment, but I know that there seems to be a trend towards that changing. So you should be able to, if you're collecting data from mTurk, for example, there's no reason why you couldn't share your raw data files because they're kind of anonymized by definition. The only identifiers are potentially demographic information questions that you ask, and then their mTurk worker ID, which isn't tied to any personal information of those workers online. Similarly, I should just add that you can also, of course, store audio files, video files, image files, things like that. When it comes to the merge request, you can require that you can require approval by different members in the project. So if I just share my screen again, if I go to the merge request, if I just make a new merge request, I think I'll have to, I don't know if this is going to work or not, just because I'm using, yeah, I'm not going to be able to do it right now. But once you get to the next screen, you'll be able to select, you can select approver. I think you can require approval, and then you can actually select the members that you need to approve. And then similarly, in the settings, I believe you can change your settings so that any change requires approval from different members in the project. But I have to look into that for a second to actually show you how to do that. Thanks for the question. That was really, really good one. Is it possible, okay, so this is just a follow-up question. Is it possible to share a project but hide subfolders? Yeah, you can do that. So you can do that in your permissions settings. So you can select different parts of the experiment that are shared within the group and set access to certain folders based on the level of permissions that those users have.
Fantastic. Thank you for those questions. Please feel free. We have probably about 15 minutes left for questions at this point. If you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to do that. Or like I said before, just enter it into the chat.
Jordan, this is Gary again. If I can come back to the Japanese question, are there any character set restrictions, anything that could be problematic using different languages?
No, not at all. You can just think of the repository as like a Dropbox. So it's capable of holding anything in it. There's no restrictions that way. So if it can be on a folder on your desktop, it can be on a repository online. Oh, hi, Mary. This is not related to GitHub, so please feel free to answer quickly. It's possible to record. Okay, yeah, I'm getting the impression that a lot of people want to be recording audio from participants. So that's a good question. I was talking with who was it? Young Me a little bit about this at the beginning of the or before the office hour started. But at the moment, you can't use PsychoPy to record the audio files. You can use PsychoPy to record audio if it's run locally using Python. But if it's running online, you currently can't do that. So if you're, for example, maybe you could even do it on mTurk, but the way you'd have to find a workaround. And so what you would probably want to do is to include within your audio file, within your PsychoPy3 experiment, you'd want to include audio files that play at a specified time within the experiment. And you might even want to create your own custom audio files so that you can clearly recognize them. So if you kind of have that profile of what that sound looks like in Audacity, for example, what you could then do is have participants kind of turn their mic on and record from the beginning of the experiment and save one long continuous audio file. What you can then do is to detect the position in that larger continuous audio file where the sound cue was played, and then use that to sync up the millisecond timing of the audio file and of the trials in the experiment. So, for example, if you're doing if you're just having participants read words aloud that are presented to them on the screen, then you, at the beginning of each trial, you would just have the internal experiment clock kind of read out the time and save that into the data output file. And then you could then use those timings to have them line up. Similarly, you can also have sounds that are generated at the beginning. And I'm only just starting to learn how to do this myself, but you can then use like machine learning or audio detection algorithms to actually pull out the specific timings within the continuous audio file where those preset audio cues were played, and allow you to kind of divide up your audio file that way. But yeah, it's a little bit finicky, and it's just a matter of figuring out workarounds for it. But there's no reason why it's not impossible. It's just a little bit difficult at the moment. So it's not made that much easier by PsychoPy, but at least PsychoPy can help ensure the millisecond timing accuracy of your stimulus presentation. Okay, so another question. How easy is it to convert existing standalone PsychoPy experiments to web-based versions? I read somewhere that I have to manually translate scripting elements to JavaScript. Will it just work? No, it absolutely will not work at all. Oh, sorry. Yeah, if you only use builder elements, yes, it'll work fine. But only the ones that are allowed that are kind of currently part of the PsychoJS library. I'll just share my screen again. If I go to this website here, so this is all the documentation for PsychoJS, which is the library that was created by the PsychoPy development team for the purposes of creating these online experiments. And so if you go down to here, so which PsychoPy components are supported by PsychoJS, there's a list here. So as long as you're only using these elements, then yes, it will work just fine. But anything else, you will have to, like any other custom code components that you're developing in your Python version, you have to make sure that you use the PsychoJS library, or you'll be using JavaScript to code those. But like the experiment that I ran today, the lexical decision task, that was just using a text component and a button press. and I didn't have to do any, I didn't have to have any knowledge of JavaScript in order to have that be hosted online. Once it automatically generates the JavaScript for when you click the export HTML button in PsychoPy. All right, also related to audio, are you aware of any reporting on the timing of audio file playback for PsychoPy3 online? Yeah, so initially there was a lot of concerns about the timing of audio presentation, and it wasn't necessarily that accurate, but the most recent version of PsychoPy, or I think probably for the last 3 or 4 months now, maybe a bit longer than that. They have a new audio backend that you can use called PTB that does guarantee very accurate stimulus presentation times. There's also other things that you can do when you're actually building your experiment that will kind of prevent any lag issues. But the main thing is that all of the audio files that you're going to be playing will all be loaded at the beginning of the experiment. They'll be kind of downloaded onto the browser of the person who's doing the experiment. So actually, I wouldn't necessarily recommend using WAV files. It depends on the length of your audio. Like if you're just using individual words, then WAV files can be fine. But if you have like 3-minute, if you're doing some kind of listening comprehension task, like 3-minute WAV files tend to get pretty big. And if you're kind of downloading 150 megabytes worth of audio files at the beginning of every experiment, that can really use up the space that the browser, it uses up the cache in your browser. And the more of the browser cache that you're using, the bigger the chance that the experiment is going to crash. So you kind of want to avoid doing that. So I've, in experiments that have very long audio files, I'd suggest using MP3, for example. That tends to be a bit smaller. But then another thing you can do to kind of safeguard against any potential delays is add a buffer at the beginning of each routine. So when it's going through the loop, it's going to kind of, the audio backend is going to load the next audio file into the player at the beginning of each routine. So if you have the audio file set to play exactly at the beginning of the routine, then you kind of open the door to potential delays. But if you just include like a 1-second buffer between the beginning of the routine and when the audio file is set to play, then that's a good way to ensure that there's not going to be any inaccuracy in terms of audio playback. I hope that helps. And sorry, if you're doing that, it's always best to have have the buffer be a separate routine. So just like a routine that shows either a blank screen or like a cross in the middle of the screen for a second. Cool. Yeah, no problem. Any other questions? I'm getting the impression that most people are more curious about asking PsychoPy questions. So any questions at all related to PsychoPy, I'm also happy to answer here. Okay, so the benefit of using GitLab instead of Dropbox is it just cuts down on the amount of time you have to spend moving files around. So what Dropbox, as far as I know anyway, doesn't do is it doesn't keep track of all the changes that are made to files that are uploaded into Dropbox. So I was actually using Dropbox for another project, and it was a bit finicky because sometimes I would be making changes to files, but not necessarily updating the names of those files. We also couldn't keep track of what was changed each time. And so every time I uploaded something to Dropbox, I also needed to kind of send a long, detailed email about all of the changes that I made. Whereas if you're just managing changes to stimulus files or audio files or anything like that on something like GitLab, all of that's built in. So it makes the whole process very transparent. So anytime I'm uploading a new change, it should auto syncs and has a version control. It doesn't allow someone else to improve. It's doesn't allow someone to improve. Okay. Yeah, cool. So maybe I'm just not that familiar with Dropbox. But I think probably the main thing is that GitLab is also then directly associated with PsychoPy3. So again, if you're just sharing files, then there's no reason to be doing that on GitLab, right? But it's mainly because GitLab is just kind of the default repository for PsychoPy3 experiments. So if you're doing anything with PsychoPy3, it's just better to have it be affecting the repository directly on GitLab. It prevents it kind of keeps everybody up to date with the current kind of status of the project, as well as allowing for the version control that I didn't really have a chance to show you today. But what that means is if somebody makes a change to the project that you don't like, you can always revert back to earlier versions. Similarly, I have a lot of requests from people who are having technical issues with their PsychoPy3 script, or so the experiment isn't running for whatever reason. And rather than trying to describe exactly what's going on or describe errors that they're experiencing, it's easier just to share a repository with me. I can then go in, see what kind of replicate any errors that are occurring, and then make the changes that are required. So it's very useful for that kind of troubleshooting aspect as well. And I found that it's much more convenient than Dropbox in that sense. Because after all, the kind of GitLab, GitHub platform is all designed for software development. It's not really designed for just file sharing, for example. So Dropbox is going to be better for file sharing, but not as good for troubleshooting and things like that. So thanks for the presentation. I haven't worked with PsychoPy3 much, but I was wondering for future experiments if participants could run the experiments we design on PsychoPy3 on their own computers online, or does someone need to download the app to get it running? Okay, so they shouldn't need to download anything at all. What PsychoPy3 does is it creates experiments that can be run on a web browser. So the only thing that you need to run a PsychoPy3 experiment is a web browser and the link to the experiment. So if I'll just quickly share my screen again. If I go to Pavlovia, so this is again the platform where all of those experiments are going to be hosted. If I want somebody to run one of my experiments, I have to make sure that the experiment is actually running. So I'd set it to running, and I have to make sure that I set some credits to that experiment, because every time someone runs the experiment successfully, a credit will be used up. So you'll have to buy credits and then assign them here. But then all someone would need is to take this link, which you can then send out or post publicly online. They would click on this link, and it's going to direct them to the experiment itself, not to this screen, but to a screen that looks more like, well, it looks like this. So they'll be brought directly to this page where they'll then run the experiment. So they shouldn't need to download anything as long as they have a web browser, which isn't too much of an ask these days. Yeah, so, and then I guess in a lab environment like the one we have, sorry, just to address Christina's comment, it is good for troubleshooting. It's also good in lab environments where you're kind of all going through the learning process of how to use PsychoPy or how to build an experiment, because it allows multiple people to kind of have input and make changes to the experiment code. It also allows you to kind of look at what other people have done, see how it works, kind of fork their repositories, copy their experiments without having to kind of email them, contact them, get them to send it to you, or create something on a Dropbox. So it's a nice way of being able to share technology as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and comments, and thank you, Jordan, for your presentation. As we're now at 1:02 p.m., we're going to wrap it up. But if you do have other questions, feel free to email the wordsintheworldgrant@gmail.com email address. You can also send questions and inquiries to Jordan through that email address, and I'll just forward it on to him. But thank you very much, Jordan.
Sure. If I could just add one more thing. I'm also going to be including tutorials on how to do all of these things on my YouTube channel. And so if there's anything, there's a lot of things on there that I haven't covered here, especially how to access those experiment templates. So for example, I know, Christina, that you do a lot of typing tasks and typing-based research. That can also be a bit tough using PsychoPy because it doesn't have that kind of functionality built in. So I have experiments that include the code that you need in JavaScript to detect typed input and things like that. Also, thanks, Victor, for coming. Appreciate that. All right, cool. Yeah, thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it. Thanks for your time, and I hope this was useful.
All of the recording available and links to Jordan's YouTube channels, which are expensive at this point, the videos on there, that'll all be posted on the Word website as well. So you'll be able to access those there, and I'll send out a link through the mailing list. Thanks so much and have a great week.